On a brisk December morning, one that hinted at the upcoming holiday cheer, Nancy, often called Nancy by friends and family, was getting ready for her company's Christmas party. The scent of fresh hair dye mingled with the steam from her husband Eric's shower, creating a cozy yet chaotic atmosphere typical of their lively home. Nancy was enjoying a rare moment of tranquility when her phone vibrated with a new message. It was Mrs. Linda, her mother-in-law, announcing she'd be visiting soon. Unsurprisingly, as she had a habit of dropping in unannounced. Nancy checked the time. It was 11:05 a.m., and Mrs. Linda would be arriving in just half an hour. As Nancy hurried to wash out the hair dye, she heard the front door swing open. Mrs. Linda strode in, her presence overwhelming as usual, her eyes scanning the room. "Where's Kevin?" she asked sharply, her tone tinged with annoyance. Nancy replied with as much calm as she could muster, "He's with Catherine, my best friend. They've gone Christmas shopping together, and she'll be watching him overnight. That way, Eric and I can go to the party without worries." Mrs. Linda's eyebrows drew together in disapproval. "It seems every time I want to see him, Kevin is with Catherine," she stated, her voice escalating with every word. Nancy tried to keep her cool. "Mom, Catherine, and I enjoy taking Kevin on little outings. It gives Eric some quiet time, and works well for us." But Mrs. Linda seemed far from convinced. She began a long lecture on the importance of keeping family close, especially during the festive season. Her words were cutting, filled with criticism and a stern view of what she believed family should be like. At that moment, Tyler, Nancy's older son, walked into the room. At 21 years old, he had an air of maturity that made him seem wise beyond his years. He had often disagreed with Mrs. Linda's conservative outlook, which he found outdated and restrictive. This scene encapsulates a typical family dynamic, where differing views on how to spend time and prioritize relationships during the holidays come to the fore, creating a tapestry of tension and affection that defines many families. Nancy and her family are navigating these waters, trying to maintain harmony while honoring their individual needs and relationships. Tyler stood firm, his decision clear. "I won't be at your house on Christmas Day," he told Mrs. Linda, his voice calm but resolute. His statement seemed to strike a nerve, as Mrs. Linda's face flushed a deep red, the intensity of her emotions palpable. The conversation quickly escalated. Despite the rising tension, Tyler held his ground, repeating, "No, I am not going." I stepped in, attempting to diffuse the situation and remind Mrs. Linda of the family boundaries we had agreed upon. However, she seemed to spiral beyond reach, her control slipping away. "Why can't you just be there?" she pleaded, her voice cracking, each word heavy with emotion. Her question unearthed painful memories from 2 years prior, when Deborah and Matthew, my sister-in-law and her husband, had disciplined Kevin, then only 7, without consulting us. That incident left deep wounds not only on Kevin but on our entire family. I tried to explain, to make her see the reasons behind our boundaries, but it was as if I was speaking to a brick wall. Mrs. Linda had never been one to respect limits, much less understand them. Standing in my kitchen, with a towel still stained with dye wrapped around my head, I faced the full force of Mrs. Linda's anger. Her fury was like a storm, fierce and unpredictable. "It's always Catherine this, Catherine that. What about family?" she exclaimed, her voice escalating with each word. I tried to reason with her. "Catherine is family in a way. She's been there for us, for Kevin. It's not about choosing her over you," I explained, striving to maintain a calm demeanor. But Mrs. Linda was relentless. "You're excluding us, your own family. It's Christmas, Nancy. It's a time for family to be together," she argued, her eyes flashing a mix of anger and hurt. It was a delicate balance, one I had been maintaining for years. My husband Eric and I had different ideas about relaxation. He was a homebody, content with his hobbies and his circle of friends, while I thrived on going out and taking part in activities with Catherine and Kevin. This arrangement, though unconventional, worked perfectly for us. Eric always knew he was welcome to join in whenever he chose. This story paints a picture of a family navigating the complexities of individual needs versus familial expectations, particularly during the emotionally charged holiday season. It showcases the struggles of maintaining personal boundaries while trying to preserve family unity. Tyler's declaration was clear. "I won't be at your house on Christmas Day," he stated, his voice steady and firm. The confrontation caused Mrs. Linda's face to flush a deep red, a sign of the brewing storm. As the argument intensified, Tyler remained adamant, repeating firmly, "No, I am not going." To mediate, I reminded Mrs. Linda of the family boundaries we had previously established, but it was as if she was blind to our reasoning. Her plea, laden with emotion, broke through. "Why can't you just be there?" It echoed with the pain of past conflicts, specifically an incident 2 years ago involving Deborah and Matthew, my sister-in-law, and her husband, who had harshly disciplined Kevin, then just 7 years old, without our consent. This breach of trust had left deep scars, affecting not just Kevin, but all of us deeply. Attempting to clarify our stance, I explained to Mrs. Linda that these boundaries were necessary for Kevin's well-being. Despite his ADD, Kevin is a bright and energetic child who thrives under guidance filled with understanding and empathy, not judgment or harsh punishment. We strive to create a loving environment where he feels supported. Yet, as I spoke, the air thickened with tension, the festive decor of the house starkly contrasting with the mood in our kitchen. Mrs. Linda's inability to see the damage caused by her daughter and son-in-law's actions was palpable, possibly clouded by her deep family loyalty or entrenched societal norms. Trying to remain composed, I sat as Mrs. Linda's small frame seemed to tower with indignation, demanding an explanation or any sort of compromise that would conform to her ideal of a family Christmas. But some wounds are too deep to simply be set aside, even for the holidays. In the midst of this, Tyler stood by, his young face set with the resolve of someone who has come to trust his judgment. He calmly faced his grandmother, unaffected by her growing anger. "Grandma, I've told you. I'm uncomfortable with your views. I won't pretend just for the sake of the holiday," he asserted, his voice resolute. Mrs. Linda's disbelief twisted her features. "You're being disrespectful, Tyler. It's Christmas, a time for family to come together. Despite our differences," she countered, her voice strained. Tyler's stance remained unyielding, a testament to his sensitivity towards bigotry and discrimination, traits he has always been keenly aware of. This story highlights the challenges of navigating complex family dynamics during a time traditionally meant for unity and celebration. It underscores the notion that understanding and acceptance must sometimes bridge the gap between personal beliefs and familial obligations. Tyler's stance against the narrow-minded attitudes of some family members marked a clear boundary. He could not ignore such issues. "Family doesn't mean tolerating hate," he asserted. Mrs. Linda was visibly shaken by his forthrightness. "We're your family, Tyler. How can you turn your back on us?" she implored. I observed the exchange, torn between my admiration for Tyler's bravery and my anxiety over the escalating conflict. This confrontation was not sudden, but the peak of years of buried disagreements and clashing views that we had long navigated as a family. Our initial plan was simple: to visit Mrs. Linda on Christmas Eve for a few hours. This was our way of preserving some semblance of family unity while still upholding our principles. However, Tyler's firm decision to skip any Christmas Day gatherings at her house was a definitive line in the sand. Frustrated, Mrs. Linda turned to me, pleading, "Nancy, talk some sense into your son. He's tearing this family apart." But how could I? Tyler's convictions were a mirror of the values that Eric and I had instilled in him, values of respect, equality, and tolerance. As I attempted to mediate, reminding Mrs. Linda of our commitment to visit on Christmas Eve, it was clear she was beyond consolation. Her ideal vision of a perfect family Christmas was unraveling, and with it, her composure. "You're all ungrateful," she lamented, her voice cracking. After everything I've done for this family, the conversation spiraled, going in circles with no end in sight. Tyler's position, though difficult for Mrs. Linda to accept, was an essential affirmation of his identity and beliefs. He was taking a stand against the prejudices that had long overshadowed our family gatherings. At that moment, the generational divide within our family was starkly evident, a chasm deepened by evolving social consciousness and rigid traditions. The dispute in our kitchen had evolved into more than just a disagreement. It was a revelation of deeper wounds and long-standing conflicts. Mrs. Linda's insistence on a unified family Christmas, despite the evident issues, was tainted with denial, refusing to acknowledge the real reasons behind our reservations. Her vision for the holidays, wrapped in the guise of family unity, ignored the underlying tensions that needed to be addressed for true harmony. As I faced Mrs. Linda, I searched for the words to bridge the gap between us. "Mom, you know why we can't just be there," I began softly, recalling the incident that had reshaped our family dynamics. 2 years ago, during a family event, Deborah and Matthew had taken it upon themselves to discipline Kevin for his high-spirited behavior, a direct result of his ADHD. They had misunderstood, or perhaps hadn't bothered to understand, that Kevin's vibrancy wasn't misbehavior, but part of his personality. Worse, they had physically reprimanded him, crossing a profound line for Eric and me. The memory was painful. Kevin, only 7 at the time, had run to us in tears, confused and hurt by the actions of family members he had trusted. It was a betrayal that deeply fractured our family, the effects of which we were still mending. For a brief moment, Mrs. Linda's features softened, hinting at an understanding, but it vanished quickly, replaced by her usual obstinance. "They were just trying to help. He needs to learn discipline," she insisted, her tone resolute. A wave of protectiveness washed over me. "We do discipline Kevin, but in a way that helps him understand and grow. We talk to him and help him regulate his emotions. We don't believe in physical punishment," I responded, my voice firm yet calm. Mrs. Linda shook her head, clearly unable to accept our parenting style. "In my time, a little discipline never hurt anyone. You're all too soft on him," she retorted, dismissing our methods. The conversation seemed futile. Mrs. Linda, entrenched in her ways, could not see the damage Deborah and Matthew's actions had caused. To her, the family was about sticking together no matter what. However, for us, it was about respect, understanding, and empathy, values that seemed increasingly foreign to her. The tension in the room was palpable. Mrs. Linda's inability to acknowledge our pain or understand our perspective felt like an insurmountable wall. As much as I wished for a harmonious family gathering, I knew some divides were too deep to bridge. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with years of unspoken grievances and misunderstandings. Mrs. Linda's insistence on maintaining appearances and upholding a facade of familial unity was crumbling under the weight of reality. As we stood there, the air thick with unresolved issues, it was clear that achieving a truly united family would require more than just showing up. It would need a fundamental shift in understanding and acceptance, a shift that seemed increasingly unlikely as the conversation stagnated. Mrs. Linda continued to press for our attendance at the family Christmas gathering, and I could feel the tension in the air mounting. Tyler stood by quietly, his earlier words echoing in the silence. Eric, freshly emerged from his shower, entered the room, adding yet another layer to the already charged atmosphere. "I don't understand why you can't just show up. Is it so hard to be a family for one day?" Mrs. Linda implored, desperation tinging her voice. Her plea hit a nerve, but not in the way she might have hoped. "It's not just about showing up, Mom. It's about respect and acknowledging the pain that's been caused," I replied, my voice steady yet heavy with emotion. At that moment, something in Mrs. Linda snapped. Her face twisted with frustration and anger, and she raised her hand as if to strike. Instinctively, I dodged, standing up from my chair, a mix of shock and defiance in my eyes. "Enough!" I exclaimed. "I won't let you guilt-trip us. Not me. Not my sons. We have our boundaries, and it's high time you respect them." The room fell silent. Mrs. Linda's hand hovered in the air, a stark symbol of the breach that had just occurred. Eric stepped forward, his demeanor calm, contrasting sharply with the emotional chaos around us. "Mom, you need to leave," he said, his voice firm but free from anger. This isn't how we solve things in this family. The standoff that followed was tense. Mrs. Linda, her pride wounded and her authority challenged, looked between us as if seeing us truly for the first time. There was a brief, fleeting moment where I thought I saw regret in her eyes, but it quickly gave way to her familiar, stubborn resolve. Without a word, she turned and left, the door closing behind her with a finality that seemed symbolic. We stood there, united not just by blood, but by a shared understanding of what was right and wrong. The encounter with Mrs. Linda marked a turning point, a moment where we chose respect and empathy over compliance and tradition. After her departure, the house felt eerily silent, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the shock of the confrontation. Eric, Tyler, and I sat down, a collective sigh escaping our lips. It was a moment of reflection, a pause in the emotional storm that had just swept through our home. "We did the right thing," Eric said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, reassuring. It was a moment to reaffirm our values and the boundaries that protected them, a confirmation that, despite the challenges, our commitment to each other and our principles remained unwavering. Eric's eyes revealed the internal struggle he faced. Standing up to his mother had been difficult for him, but the core values we held as a family were solid and unyielding. Tyler, showing a maturity beyond his years, nodded in agreement. "I'm proud of us," he said, his voice carrying a weight that resonated deeply with each of us. I looked at them, my heart filled with a complex blend of emotions. I felt immense pride in how we stood together, united against adversity, and yet I also felt a deep sorrow for the family ties that had been stretched, perhaps to a breaking point. "We've always known our family was different," I mused aloud, the thought hanging in the air. "But being different doesn't mean being wrong. We've built something special here, something founded on understanding, respect, and love." The conversation then turned to the upcoming Christmas party, a welcome change from the day's earlier tensions. Catherine, a testament to the family we had chosen, not just the one we were born into, would be joining us. "We'll have a good time tonight," I said, a smile beginning to form. "And tomorrow, we'll have our celebration with your brother, a small but meaningful gathering." As we talked, the lingering tension started to ebb away, replaced by a growing excitement for the festivities ahead. It reminded us that despite the challenges we faced, we had each other, a foundation strong enough to withstand any storm. In that moment, I understood that boundaries weren't just about keeping others out. They were about protecting and nurturing what was truly important. As the day transitioned to evening and we prepared for the party, a sense of resolve washed over me. Our family, with all its complexities and imperfections, was a tapestry woven with threads of resilience, love, and a profound understanding of what it meant to be there for each other, no matter the circumstances. The evening of the Christmas party arrived, a vivid contrast to the day's earlier strife. As Eric, Tyler, and I stepped into the festive atmosphere, decked out with twinkling lights and merry decorations, a wave of relief swept through me. The room was filled with laughter and music, creating a bubble of joy and escapism. Catherine welcomed us with her characteristic warmth, her presence reinforcing the bonds of the family we had consciously built, a family defined not by blood alone, but by shared values and mutual support. Catherine had become more than just my best friend. She was a confidant, an aunt, and a sister in every sense that mattered. Her understanding smile at the party let me know she was aware of the day's tensions, yet her eyes communicated unwavering support and solidarity. The party provided a delightful escape, a chance to revel in the company of friends and colleagues. As we mingled, laughed, and danced, the burdens of Mrs. Linda's visit began to fade, replaced by feelings of freedom and belonging. Tyler, typically reserved, found joy that evening, his earlier confrontation with his grandmother receding into the backdrop of the night's merriment. Eric, ever the quiet observer, watched over us with a contented smile, his affection for our tight-knit family clear in his gentle gaze. As the night progressed, my thoughts drifted to the next day's planned gathering with my brother. It would be a smaller affair, but no less meaningful. This gathering was a celebration of our core values: respect, understanding, and unconditional love. The party eventually wound down, and as we headed home, the streets were quiet, the festive lights guiding our way. Inside the car, the silence was comfortable and reflective. We had weathered a significant storm, but it left us with a renewed sense of purpose and unity. Lying in bed that night, the day's events replayed in my mind. I realized that the strength of our family lay in our ability to embrace our differences, to stand up for our beliefs, and to choose love over conformity. Our Christmas would be different this year, but it would be distinctly ours, a celebration of the bonds we had nurtured, the challenges we had overcome, and the love that held us together. In the end, what mattered most was knowing that we were there for each other, unconditionally and without reservation. Our family, with all its quirks and challenges, stood as a testament to the enduring power of love, understanding, and the courage to stand up for what's right. This realization brought a deep sense of peace, wrapping around me like a warm blanket as I drifted off to sleep, reassured by the strength and love of the family we had built and chosen.